The 1920s and 30s were a time when many African American artists banded together to pay tribute to their heritage. One prominent musician was William Grant Still, a pioneer in the search for a modern American sound, who opened a wide range of opportunities for African Americans in music. In the early 1900s, economic opportunity brought increasing numbers of African Americans to New York City, especially to Harlem. There developed a growing sense of a new Black identity, looking to Africa for inspiration and seeking racial equality and Black cultural pride. The Renaissance was a movement that highlighted African American intellectual life in the 1920s and 30s by looking to its historical and ethnic roots and rejecting the stereotyped images of Blacks popularized by minstrel shows. Prominent figures in the Harlem Renaissance include the sculptor Richmond Barthé, the poet Langston Hughes, who imitated the rhythms and flow of jazz in his poetry, and the poet Neil Hurston, and musicians Duke Ellington and William Grant Still. Of the suite allowed Still to draw on established practices to evoke images of Black America's artistic efforts. Each movement is based on various artworks by African American artists. All of the movements use modal harmonies and blues-style melodies. The last movement features a flashy and syncopated violin melody against a stride piano-style bass. Still grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and began studying the violin at a young age. He moved to Memphis and then to New York, working as an arranger for radio and musical theater, while continuing his classical studies with Edvard Varese. He then moved away from the avant-garde music of his teacher to find his voice in his Black cultural heritage. Still's first symphony, The Afro-American, was premiered in 1931 by the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, and was the first symphony by an African American composer to be performed by a major American orchestra. In 1934, Still moved to Los Angeles and started writing film and television scores. In 1949, his opera, Troubled Island, with a libretto by Langston Hughes, was produced by New York City's Opera, another first for an African American composer. Several musicians attempted to bring jazz forward as a distinctive kind of cultivated music. They were sometimes criticized for whitewashing an African American tradition and for bringing commercial music into the concert hall. Gershwin began as a song plugger, demonstrating and selling sheet music on Tin Pan Alley. Writers had been capitalizing on the rising fashion for ragtime and jazz, and most popular songs made some reference to those styles. Gershwin, a white man of Jewish heritage, was renowned for his ability to play in a jazzy way, which gained him opportunities not available to African American musicians of the time. When writing his own Broadway and Tin Pan Alley songs, he also incorporated jazz elements. Gershwin sought to expand jazz into the cultivated sphere, and his first success was his Rhapsody in Blue for piano and orchestra from 1924. It premiered on a concert billed as An Experiment in Modern Music. Gershwin then traveled to Paris to study, but was turned away by Nadia Boulanger. She felt classical training would have a negative effect on his style. During his brief stay in Paris, he wrote the orchestral jazz tone poem An American in Paris in 1928. He grew up in Manhattan. He started out by working for a Tin Pan Alley publisher playing and singing new releases for customers. This is called a song plugger. He had his first big hit in 1920 with Swanee, recorded by Al Jolson. International acclaim came with Rhapsody in Blue, followed by his Concerto in F and An American in Paris. In addition, Gershwin, along with his brother Ira, had a string of hit musicals and wrote enduring film scores. The folk opera Porgy and Bess is perhaps his masterpiece. Style is a perfect union of popular and classical, vernacular and art. Gershwin called Porgy and Bess a folk opera, two seemingly incompatible terms. The drama presents an African American spin on traditional operatic topics. It contains continuous music, leitmotifs, and is serious in tone, but also featured song and dance numbers. Gershwin insisted that the entire cast be classically trained black singers. The opening aria, Summertime, evokes an African American spiritual and is reprised several times throughout the opera. Porgy and Bess served as an inspiration to some composers wanting to incorporate jazz elements into their works, but some African American musicians were suspicious of this Euro-American depiction of their culture. Patriotism is an essential part of national identity, but in a nation of immigrants like America, we have struggled to define the nature of American identity. Some of the most compelling American sounds have emerged from attempts to integrate vernacular musical traditions with music that aims at a higher quality of spirit. Vernacular music can be defined as music created by or intended for ordinary people not needing musical training to appreciate, and has some connection to the culture of the creator and the listener. Non-concert traditions, like marching bands, play a vital role in North American musical life of the late 1800s. Ives was steeped in the vernacular heritage of his country, but his compositional voice was modernist, incorporating polytonality, polyharmony, and polyrhythm. Remember, the root word poly just means multiple. Therefore, polyrhythm means multiple rhythms, often complex, sounding simultaneously. Born in Danbury, Connecticut. His father was a former Civil War bandleader and a town musician. Ives became a church organist at age 13, then went to Yale to study composition. He decided against music as a profession and instead went into the insurance business, composing in his spare time. After privately printing and distributing for free his Piano Sonata No. 2 and a collection titled 114 Songs, Ives gained the support of other experimental composers. Ives gradually became known to the general public and gained fame at the age of 73. Tunes, mostly well-known musical quotations from Ives' childhood, simulates the realism of amateur outdoor bands' skills. Musicians play out of tune, make bad entrances, miscount, and hit wrong notes. Most contemporaries in the art music sphere considered commercial music, as opposed to folk music, inadequate as a resource for artistic development. During the Great Depression, Aaron Copland espoused the ideal that art should serve the American people. His style, designed to have wide appeal and useful in a variety of contexts, was rooted primarily in Appalachian and other Anglo-American folk melodies. Born in Brooklyn and went to Paris to study with Nadia Boulanger in his early 20s. He returned writing in jazz and neoclassical idioms, but during the 1930s and 40s, he changed directions toward a populist style. Central to his popularity were the ballets Billy the Kid, Rodeo, and Appalachian Spring, and his film scores for Of Mice and Men, The Red Pony, and The Heiress. Despite his apparent patriotism, Copland's leftist politics led to him being investigated in the 1950s as a communist supporter during the McCarthy-era Red Scare. The ballet Appalachian Spring was a collaboration with choreographer Martha Graham. It portrays a pioneer celebration around a newly built farmhouse in 19th century Pennsylvania. Copland created an orchestral suite from the ballet music in 1945. The opening section of the suite evokes daybreak. The seventh section is a set of variations on the Shaker song Simple Gifts. The culture and history of the United States and Mexico have been intertwined since well before the two countries came into their modern borders. Other Americans also worked to reconcile their connection with European traditions while crafting a uniquely American sound and sharing with the United States a nationalist approach through reference to vernacular traditions. Ties to Spain began in 1519 when Mexico was colonized by the Spaniards and continued until independence was gained in 1821. By the late 19th century, the goal of creating a nationally distinctive style lured musicians and artists to Native American and mestizo cultures. Mestizo refers to mixed Spanish and Native American ancestry. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 conjured up strong feelings of patriotism, and composers such as Carlos Chavez and Silvestre Revueltas tried to evoke the character of the Native American music. Realism drew on elements of Mexico's traditional culture. It was highly flavored with folk elements, especially mariachi band music. During the Spanish Civil War, the poet Federico Garcia Lorca was executed by a fascist firing squad. Revueltas' homage blends the traditions of Mexican vernacular and European modernist music and is written for chamber ensemble. The title of Movement 3, Song, refers to a traditional Mexican song dance. It features shifting meters, moving between simple triple and compound, and is evocative of mariachi ensembles. Revueltas studied composition in Mexico City and in the United States. He became assistant conductor of the Orquesta Sinfónica de Mexico. The intensely political Revueltas went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s to support the Loyalists. His love of Mexican provincial music is clear in his lyrical melodies, driven by polyrhythms and ostinatos. Mexican composer, conductor, and music theorist Carlos Chavez instigated a government-sponsored program to develop a national musical voice, which caught the attention of Aaron Copland and prompted a visit to Mexico. Mariachi ensembles provide a strong nationalist voice. Their costumes, called charros, represent Mexican cowboys. In traditional mariachi music, the melody group is played by the violins and trumpets, and a singer if it is a vocal piece. The rhythm section is played by vihuelas, Mexican rhythm guitar, standard guitar, guitarrón, which is a bass guitar, and harp. The mariachi song El Cihuateco is an example of this tradition and an example of the son dance style. Specific musical characteristics that are meaningful in a particular cultural context may change meaning when taken outside that context. Similarly, sometimes new meanings can arise from the integration of traditional and folk music into experimental art music. One way of rejecting the 19th century was to return to even earlier eras by emulating music of the early 18th century. The detached, objective style of Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi was appealing to some modernists who had a preference for absolute music and focused attention on craftsmanship. Neoclassical composers valued the formal over the expressive and revived many older forms, such as the fugue and the suite. 20th century nationalism prized traditional musics because they departed from the conventional mold. Phonographs were taken into the field to preserve traditional songs exactly as they were performed, composers attempting to retain their original flavor. Béla Bartók reconciled the traditional songs of his native Hungary with the main currents of European music. With his colleague Zoltán Kodály, Béla Bartók collected over 2,000 songs and dances. He is often considered one of the first ethnomusicologists. These recordings served as raw material for Bartók's neoclassical style. Bartók was born in Hungary and educated at the Royal Academy in Budapest. He and his colleague Kodály toured the remote villages of Hungary to collect native songs. Troubled by the alliance between Hungary and the Nazis around the time of World War II, Bartók moved to New York City in 1940. Through his study, Bartók discovered that Eastern European traditional music was based on ancient modes, unfamiliar scales, and non-symmetrical rhythms. He used these while adhering to classical form, coming up with a unique form of neoclassicism. For 1843, Bartók was commissioned to write the Concerto for Orchestra. Movement 4, Interrupted Intermezzo, demonstrates Bartók's blending of nationalism and modernism. The opening tune evokes Hungarian folk song and a non-symmetrical rhythm. It is followed by a broad string theme. The mood is disrupted by a clarinet melody borrowed from Russian composers Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7. Later in the movement, the two opening themes eventually return. Half of the 19th century, ethnomusicologists studied non-Western and traditional music within their cultural contexts. They went to the villages to do field work and make recordings, then returned to their studios to make transcriptions intended to preserve the traditions. The songs Bartók and Kodály collected reflect the essence of the people they studied and their social rituals.